We expected to see the Outback come alive, but not like this.
Imagine the Australian desert transformed into a vast inland sea. Sound impossible? Well, for nearly a century, some of Australia's most respected engineers, scientists, and politicians believed they could make it happen. This is the story of one of history's most audacious engineering dreams. A plan so bold it would have reshaped an entire continent, but so expensive it could have bankrupted a nation. The obsession with an Australian inland sea didn't begin with engineers. It began with a stubborn myth that refused to die even when faced with overwhelming evidence. In the early 19th century, European explorers arriving in Australia faced a puzzle. The continent's rivers seemed to flow inland rather than to the coast. To European minds trained on the geography of other continents, this could only mean one thing. There must be a great inland sea somewhere in the heart of Australia, a Mediterranean of the southern hemisphere waiting to be discovered. And this wasn't just wild speculation from amateur geographers. Respected scientists drew maps showing this hypothetical sea. Naval officers planned expeditions around it. The myth became so entrenched in the colonial imagination that when Charles Sturt set out on his 1844 expedition into Central Australia, he did something that seemed absolutely insane. He brought a whaleboat. Yes, you read that correctly. Sturt and his men dragged a whaleboat through the Australian outback, convinced they'd soon be launching it onto the shores of a vast inland sea. What did Sturt find? More desert. And more desert after that. Where he expected cooling breezes off an inland sea, he found some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. His journal entries make for painful reading, like descriptions of heat so intense that the lead fell out of pencils, of men's fingernails splitting in the dryness, and of ink evaporating from inkwells before he could finish writing. The expedition nearly killed everyone involved. But here's the fascinating part. Even after Sturt and subsequent explorers proved conclusively that no inland sea existed, the dream didn't die. Instead, it evolved. If nature hadn't put an inland sea there, the thinking went, perhaps humans could build one. And that's where our story really begins.
In one of the most arid corners of Australia, Garydunda Lake Eyre is transforming from a usually dry salt lake into an oasis.
To understand why this idea gained serious traction, you need to know about Lake Eyre. It's located in the heart of South Australia and is one of the continent's strangest geographical features. It's Australia's largest lake, covering about 9,500 square kilometers when full. But here's the catch, it's almost never full. Lake Eyre sits at the lowest point on the Australian continent, about 15 meters below sea level. It's essentially a giant bowl in the desert, a vast salt pan that only fills during exceptional floods, perhaps once or twice in a human lifetime. Most of the time, it's a blinding white expanse of salt crust, shimmering with heat haze. When you stand on the shores of dry Lake Eyre, the landscape is otherworldly. The salt crust extends to the horizon, so flat and featureless that distance becomes meaningless. The silence is absolute, and the heat radiates up from the ground in waves. It feels like standing on another planet, but to the engineers and dreamers of the late 1800s and early 1900s, Lake Eyre looked like an invitation. Nature had already done half the work by creating this enormous below sea level depression. All humans needed to do was cut a canal and let the ocean rush in. How hard could it be? The appeal was logical, even obvious. If you dig a trench from the ocean to a below sea level basin, water will flow downhill. It's gravity and inevitable. And once the basin fills, you have your inland sea. Except, of course, nothing about this would prove simple. The man who first formalized this dream into an actual proposal was Sir Richard Baker, and he was a respected statesman, a scientist, and a man whose opinion carried serious weight in Australian society. He'd served as a senator and would later become the third president of the Australian Senate. So when Baker spoke, people listened. In the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, Baker championed a scheme that was breathtaking in its ambition. He proposed cutting a canal from Spencer Gulf on South Australia's coast all the way to Lake Eyre, a distance of over 320 kilometers through some of the harshest terrain imaginable. Once the canal was complete, seawater would flow downhill into the below sea level basin, creating an inland sea hundreds of kilometers across. Baker wasn't just thinking about creating a pretty lake in the desert. The benefits he envisioned were genuinely transformative. The inland sea would create a massive evaporation engine, pumping moisture into the atmosphere. This, Baker and his supporters believed, would increase rainfall across the interior, turning marginal lands into productive farmland. The logic seemed sound. Evaporation creates moisture. Moisture creates clouds. Clouds create rain. The presence of a large body of water would moderate the extreme temperatures of the interior. No more 50-degree summers or freezing winter nights. The sea would act as a thermal battery, absorbing heat in summer and releasing it in winter. And perhaps most exciting, imagine the shipping possibilities. Alice Springs could become a port city. Ships could sail into the heart of the continent. The interior would open up for commerce and development in ways previously unimaginable. New settlements would spring up around the sea's shores. Fishing industries could develop, tourism would flourish, and the entire economic geography of Australia would shift. The coast-hugging population could finally spread inland. It wasn't just wishful thinking. These ideas were rooted in legitimate observations. After all, large bodies of water do affect local climates. The Great Lakes moderate temperatures across the American Midwest. The Mediterranean Sea influences rainfall patterns across southern Europe, so why wouldn't an Australian inland sea do the same? The enthusiasm was infectious. Newspapers ran glowing editorials imagining the transformed continent. Public meetings drew huge crowds. Politicians saw nation-building potential. This was the era of great engineering triumphs. For example, the Suez Canal had just been completed, railways were spanning continents, and technology seemed to promise limitless possibility. But then came the surveys, and with the surveys came devastating news that would crack the foundation of Baker's dream. Engineers dispatched to chart a route from Spencer Gulf to Lake Eyre discovered a major problem: Lake Torrens. This lake lay directly on the path to Lake Eyre, and the surveyors brought back news that changed everything. Lake Torrens wasn't below sea level at all. In fact, it sat about 30 meters or roughly 100 feet above sea level. This transformed the entire project. You couldn't just cut a canal and let water flow downhill. You'd need to excavate through Lake Torrens, shifting millions upon millions of tons of earth and rock. The scale of excavation required was staggering. It was something that would outshine any engineering project attempted anywhere in the world up to that point. Let's put the numbers in perspective. The proposed canal would need to be over 320 kilometers long. That's roughly the distance from Washington, D.C. to New York City. It would need to be more than a kilometer wide in places and dozens of meters deep, excavated through rock, sand, and salt crust in temperatures that could kill workers. The amount of material to be removed would exceed the Panama Canal excavation by orders of magnitude, and the Panama Canal, completed years later, would take tens of thousands of workers a decade to complete and would cost thousands of lives. Early cost estimates ranged from £151 million to £3 billion in 1905 money. To give you context, Australia's entire federal budget for 1905 was about £5.5 million. The Inland Sea Canal would cost between 27 and 545 times the nation's annual budget. In today's terms, we're talking about spending somewhere between $500 billion and $10 trillion, which is obviously more than Australia's current annual GDP. Even Sir Richard Baker, the scheme's most prominent champion, had to confront this brutal reality. By 1905, he was publicly urging caution, acknowledging that existing technology simply couldn't accomplish the task at anything approaching a reasonable cost. The dream, it seemed, was dead, but as it turns out, it was only dormant.
As decades passed and Australia faced devastating droughts in the 1930s through 1950s, the inland sea concept came roaring back. This time it rode a wave of post-war optimism and technological confidence that made anything seem possible. The world had just completed incredible feats. The Panama Canal had been finished, proving humans could reshape geography on a massive scale. The Hoover Dam had tamed the Colorado River. Australia itself had undertaken the Snowy Mountains scheme.
On the 17th of October 1949, huge blasts marked the beginning of one of the world's biggest engineering projects, the Snowy Mountains Electric Scheme.
A massive hydroelectric and irrigation project that was moving water across mountain ranges and generating power for millions. If humans could do all that, surely creating an inland sea was within reach. Technology had advanced dramatically. Machines could move Earth faster than ever before. Engineering knowledge had expanded exponentially. Perhaps the dream that defeated Baker's generation could be achieved by a new generation with better tools. The droughts made the need feel urgent, as the Australian interior baked under relentless sun, as sheep died by the thousands and farmers walked off their land. As dust storms darkened the skies, the inland sea seemed less like an extravagant dream and more like a necessity. Enter Michael Sorell, a bushman and amateur engineer who became the inland sea's most passionate advocate in the 1950s. Sorell wasn't an establishment figure like Baker, but that gave him freedom to think big and challenge conventional wisdom. Sorell looked at the challenges that had stopped earlier schemes and saw not obstacles, but puzzles to be solved with modern technology. His vision was even more ambitious than Baker's. Sorell proposed not just filling Lake Eyre, but turning it into what he called a climate engine, or a massive machine for modifying Australia's weather. Here's how it would work. First, you'd dig the canal and let seawater flow in, but Sorell added a clever twist: tidal power stations along the canal that would generate electricity while water flowed into the basin. The twice-daily tides would push water in and pull it out, driving turbines. This power could help offset the scheme's enormous costs. Once Lake Eyre was filled, its massive surface area would pump moisture into the atmosphere through evaporation. But Sorell didn't want to leave rainfall to chance. He proposed using cloud seeding technology, which was by then cutting edge and controversial, to ensure the moisture would fall as rain over productive agricultural land rather than drifting away uselessly. Think of it as a controlled weather system. The scale of Sorell's vision was intoxicating. He imagined Alice Springs becoming Australia's future capital. New cities would rise on the sea's shores. Railways and roads would web across newly productive land. The entire center of the continent would become an economic powerhouse, and people believed him. Scientific expeditions were mounted to Lake Eyre. During rare floods, when the lake actually filled with water from inland rivers, researchers boated across its surface, taking measurements and dreaming of what could be.
It's incredible, isn't it? You look at the patterns, the colours, and then just start to see the bird life come on top of it again, and actually have the whole system regenerate itself. Totally fascinating.
But as scientists looked closer, they uncovered problems that no amount of optimism could overcome. The biggest, most fundamental challenge was evaporation. Lake Eyre sits in one of the hottest, driest regions on Earth. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius, and humidity is often in single digits. It's an evaporation furnace. Engineers calculated that the lake could lose up to 2,500 millimeters, or about 2.5 meters of water per year to evaporation. Now do the math. A filled Lake Eyre covers roughly 9,500 square kilometers. Losing 2.5 meters of water across that area means about 24 billion cubic meters would evaporate annually. That's equivalent to about 48 Sydney Harbor's worth of water every single year just to keep the lake from shrinking. Where would all that water come from? The only source would be continuous flow through the canal from the ocean. The canal would need to deliver roughly 760 cubic meters per second year-round just to maintain the sea's level. That's about the same as the Mississippi River's average discharge, but maintaining that flow would be a nightmare. As seawater evaporated, it would leave behind salt, massive amounts of salt. The lake would become increasingly saline, eventually more salty than the ocean itself. Within years, Lake Eyre would make the Dead Sea look fresh by comparison. This salt wouldn't just disappear, it would accumulate, forming thick crusts. Some would remain in solution, making the water hypersaline. Some would precipitate out, potentially clogging the canal system. The dream of fishing industries and thriving ecosystems would dissolve into reality. A toxic, hypersaline body of water that killed anything it touched. Instead of a life-giving sea, you'd create a lifeless salt marsh on a continental scale. Then there was the question that mattered most. Would an inland sea actually increase rainfall? This was the whole point after all. The climate modification promise was what made the astronomical costs seem potentially worthwhile. In 1974, nature provided an accidental experiment. Exceptional floods from northern Queensland rivers filled Lake Eyre to near capacity for the first time in decades. Scientists eagerly monitored weather patterns across the interior, looking for the rainfall increases that inland sea proponents had promised for generations. The results were sobering and definitive. Yes, rainfall increased, but only within about 50 kilometers of the lake's shores. Beyond that narrow band, the effect faded to nothing. There would be no greening of the outback, no transformation of the interior into productive farmland. The massive investment would produce only modest, highly localized benefits. Climate modeling in the 1960s and 70s confirmed what the 1974 flood suggested. An inland sea might slightly modify temperatures and rainfall patterns nearby, but it wouldn't fundamentally change Australia's climate. The continent's weather systems, driven by vast ocean currents and atmospheric pressure systems, were far too powerful to be significantly altered by even a massive inland lake. While the Canal to Lake Eyre scheme was faltering under scientific scrutiny, another grand vision was capturing imaginations. This one came from Dr. John Bradfield, the legendary engineer who had designed the Sydney Harbour Bridge. If anyone's engineering credentials could breathe life into a mega scheme, it was Bradfield's. The man had proven he could turn audacious visions into reality. His proposal was, in some ways, even more ambitious than the Inland Sea Canal. The Bradfield scheme proposed redirecting Australia's northern rivers, fed by monsoonal rains, southward and westward into the dry interior. Massive dams would capture the wet season floods. Tunnels bored through the Great Dividing Range would carry water to the other side. From there, canals would distribute water across the interior, irrigating parched lands and potentially even helping to fill Lake Eyre with fresh water rather than salt water. The scheme promised to irrigate over 3,000 square miles of arid land, transform desert into productive farmland, support new settlements and cities, and potentially create all the benefits of an inland sea without the salt problem. It was hailed as a snowy mountain scheme for Queensland, a nation-building project that would secure Australia's future. Through the 1940s, both major political parties debated the Bradfield scheme seriously. Newspapers ran detailed features. Public support was strong. Bradfield's reputation gave the proposal credibility that amateur schemes lacked. But once again, detailed scientific analysis proved devastating. When independent hydrologists examined Bradfield's calculations, they found serious problems. He had wildly overestimated the amount of water flowing in northern rivers, and in some cases by double. He'd failed to account for evaporation losses in the long canals. He'd underestimated how much water would soak into the ground rather than reaching its destination. And critically, he'd ignored drought variability. The northern rivers he wanted to redirect could themselves run low in dry years. The economic analysis was even more damning. Costs would run into billions of pounds in mid-20th century money, completely unrealistic for a nation that had just emerged from the Great Depression and was recovering from World War II. Even if the engineering worked perfectly, the economics didn't add up. Environmental concerns also emerged. Diverting water from coastal rivers would affect downstream ecosystems, fisheries, and existing agricultural users. The irrigated interior lands would face salinity problems, a curse that has plagued Australian irrigation schemes for decades. When you irrigate in areas with poor drainage and high evaporation, salt accumulates in the soil, eventually making land unusable. Without scientific backing or financial feasibility, the Bradfield scheme quietly died in the late 1940s and early 1950s. No grand announcement, no official cancellation, it just faded from serious political consideration. Here's what makes this story genuinely fascinating. These weren't fringe fantasies dreamed up by isolated eccentrics. The Inland Sea and Bradfield schemes were studied by government commissions, debated by universities, and examined by scientific societies at the highest levels. The proponents included senators, renowned engineers, and respected scientists. The debates played out in parliament, in academic journals, and in mainstream newspapers. For decades, these schemes occupied the same space as other mega projects that actually did get built: the Snowy Mountains scheme, the Trans-Australian Railway, massive irrigation projects. So what separated the schemes that succeeded from those that failed? 3 factors: scale and physics, science versus hope, and benefit cost ratio. The successful projects were ambitious but achievable with existing technology and didn't violate fundamental physical principles. They were based on sound hydrology and engineering, and even expensive projects could be justified if they created proportional value. You might think that by the 1970s, with scientific consensus against them, these schemes would finally be laid to rest. But the dream keeps resurfacing. In the 1980s, politicians dusted off Bradfield's proposals. In the 2000s, during severe drought, new variations emerged. Even in the 20s, you'll find advocates calling for water diversions to green the interior. Why? Because the dream speaks to something deep in the Australian psyche: the desire to conquer the tyranny of distance, to tame the harsh interior, to make the whole continent livable and productive. Australia is one of the most urbanized nations on Earth, with most of its population clinging to the coastal fringe. This reality has always chafed against the national self-image of pioneering spirit. The proposals now use modern language like climate adaptation, water security, and renewable energy integration, but at their core, they're the same dream: use engineering to fundamentally reshape the continent. The Inland Sea saga offers lessons that remain relevant today. Engineering has limits. We can't overcome fundamental physical realities like desert evaporation. Scale matters exponentially because moving water long distances becomes impossibly expensive. Nature is complicated because adding water doesn't automatically create rain. Even impossible dreams can capture imaginations for generations, and bold thinking needs to be tempered by practical analysis and honest science. The schemes that succeeded, like the Snowy Mountains project, were grounded in solid science from the start. The schemes that failed made assumptions that science couldn't support. In the end, the Inland Sea remained what it had always been: a dream. The Australian interior remains what it has always been: a vast, harsh, beautiful desert. Lake Eyre still sits dry most years. When rare floods do fill it, the lake fills temporarily with life. Flamingos arrive from thousands of kilometers away. Fish hatch from eggs dormant for decades. The desert blooms, and then the water evaporates, and the cycle begins again. Perhaps there's wisdom in nature's design. The Australian desert, for all its harshness, is a functioning ecosystem shaped by millions of years of evolution. It supports unique species found nowhere else. Aboriginal communities have thrived there for tens of thousands of years by understanding the land, not trying to transform it. The Inland Sea schemes represent one of history's great what-ifs, a blend of bold vision and ultimate impossibility. They remind us that not every dream should be realized, that sometimes the most important question isn't can we do this, but should we do this? The dreamers who proposed flooding the Outback weren't fools. They were serious people proposing serious solutions to real problems like drought, isolation, and economic development. They looked at other engineering triumphs and thought, why not this too? They just happened to be wrong. Magnificently, expensively, instructively wrong. And in being wrong, they left us with one of the most fascinating might-have-been stories in engineering history. The tale of how Australia almost drowned the Outback, and why we should probably be grateful it never happened. So what do you think about the idea of a man-made inland sea? Let us know in the comments.